Hello, everyone. I'm super happy to be here and super glad that you can join us for this conversation on video games. RightsCon uh, is having its 10-year anniversary, and it's fantastic that last year we had this conversation on video games and human rights, and for this year we have 2 dedicated sessions on video games and this fantastic fireside chat with these 2 amazing people that I have here. Maize Longboat and Kishonna Gray. I'm going to present them. Let's go here. Let's go. Sorry, I'm super nervous because I admire you so much, and I'm like super nervous about this. Let's go first with Kishonna. I'm hoping not being butchering your name. Kishonna is author of several books. Her latest book is Intersectional Tech, Black User in Digital Gaming. And she's currently an assistant professor in communication, gender, and women's studies, as well as an affiliate in Black Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She also served as a visiting assistant professor at the MIT in comparative media studies and the Women and Gender Studies program. Her research is influenced by this interdisciplinary training and grounded in critical race theory and feminist approaches to knowledge production. And also we have here Maize. Maize is as award-winning creative producer of the game Terra Nova. Terra Nova is a 2-player cooperative platform created by an indigenous-led team based in Montreal, and the game explores how would the first contact look between indigenous and settled people in a future 10,000 years from now. The game won Best Emerging Digital Interactive Work and the Imaginative Film and Media Festival in 2019. And it's available at itio.com. I'm super happy to have you both here. I'm super glad to have this conversation. And to break the ice and also my nerves, I would ask you this first question. What is your favorite game and what got you into gaming? Whatever you want to start.
Oh my goodness, that's the hardest question. You're going to start with the hardest question first. So first off, thank you for allowing me to share space with you all. My favorite game, I think I'm a huge fan of the Hitman series. I think that was like one of the games that I love playing, even though it's not like sandbox or open world. I love the worlds that you can kind of like roam and navigate. But I also love, the AI, like the awareness of like the AI, so like if you run too fast, they're like, what are you doing running? Like I think it was one of the first games where I saw such advanced AI. So I would say Hitman is probably my favorite game. But I'm gonna say, what am I playing right now? Apex Legends is the game that I'm just playing right now.
Nice. And what about you, Maize?
Hi, yeah. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. I'm super happy to be here with you both. In terms of my favorite game, I think I gotta go with like the first game I fell in love with, and that was Pokemon Blue. I played it as like a very, very young child, and I think it was the first time I kind of was able to immerse myself and kind of project my personality and my desires into a virtual world. So I'm gonna have to go with that one. And it's also fun to just like battle pets and grow your team and grow your bond through teamwork.
I love that because talking about growing bonds, and that's one of the things I love about gaming, is that how they allow us to create bonds and to find our communities. I love how Kishonna presents herself as a professor, as a gamer posing as professor. And that led me to something I wanted to ask to you. How did gaming impact on your research and work? How that this kind of gaming growing up, this culture of arcade and console gaming led you to your work and research?
That's a beautiful question. I love, with that bio, what Micaela's referencing is my Twitter bio, where I say I'm a gamer posing as a professor. Because I think, it's one of the biggest finesses and one of the biggest flexes that I feel like I've been able to do, like to figure out how to turn my love and passion of video games into like a career and a job. Like I get paid to play video games and study them and research them. I don't know. That's like the biggest flex on earth, and so I'm excited that I get to do that. But I think I'm a lifelong gamer, right? And I think how I didn't realize that I could do gaming in this way, right? I didn't know the different pathways. I didn't know what the opportunities were. I didn't know what kind of access I had to me. I didn't know what the resources were. So I'm thinking about, how I like to leverage my privileges and leverage my resources for other folks who are coming up, especially like Black and Indigenous women, trans communities and queer communities, to let them know, like, okay, this isn't just a space, for cis heterosexual white Western, people, men in particular, right? I want them to know that these are spaces where they are valuable, they're valued, they're needed, despite what the system or the structures say. I'm like, games needs us, right? But I didn't really know how to leverage that, right? And so I kind of started, kind of small and incrementally, and I started thinking, okay, well, what is it that I could do? What's my slice of the gaming world, right? I'm not industry, I'm not corporate. I've only started recently, getting access to those kinds of spaces. But I'm like, one thing that I could do is just equip folks to understand the realities of what their experiences are going to be. Like if they're streaming or, they're trying to become a content creator. I'm like, okay, or you're going in there, this is what the world's going to be. Or people who want to be designers and developers. I'm like, okay, well, these are the prior experiences. You're going to, experience probably a lot of isms and a lot of, a culture and a climate of, that folks who are actively probably trying to push you out. You're going to, there's a lot of precariousness. I'm thinking about the labor issues and, just how workers are not cared for in the industry in a lot of places. So I feel I've just tried to equip folks with the tools that they need so they can be aware. Not necessarily, I don't even want to use the word be successful, right? Because successful, that people, they measure that in different ways, right? So I want just people just to be aware of what it means to be in a marginalized and minoritized body in an industry that's dominated by so many privileged folks, right? And so I think that's where, that's why I study what I do. I study online communities. I'm like, what's our experiences when we're inside those spaces? And that's just I've just expanded that, in different kinds of ways. So yeah, that's me.
That's amazing. I was thinking through your answer about representation in games, because one of the persistent myths about gaming culture is that gaming is for males, for teenagers. And it's something that we have to fight over all the time. I represent Women in Games Argentina. That's a community that is trying to create a more diverse space that includes developers, artists, PR people, marketing people, all the people working through the chain value of the industry. And one of these persistent myths is that first, games are focused to men and are marketed to men. I had an example, one of probably my favorite game in the whole universe, that is Mass Effect. It has 3 editions, and only in the last one you can play as a male Shepard or as a female Shepard, but only in the last game the marketing materials had included the female version of the character. That is also kind of the canonical version. And that's a huge overlook on that, and something that I want to come to this point about representation, that having female characters and diverse characters is not the same that representation, because sometimes are being included like a filler app, and that takes me to Maize to ask him about his game that has a very particular take about including new narratives and new characters.
Sorry about that. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely identify with a lot of what Kishonna was saying about leveraging just being a gamer and turning it into something more, because it is part of my identity. And as I said, I've been playing games pretty much since as long as I can remember. So I've definitely grown up in this world where games are just part of the popular culture, and they just really interested me. So yeah, I definitely carried that into my studies, first at the University of British Columbia, doing my bachelor's in First Nations and Indigenous Studies. And during that degree, being introduced to all of the ways in which Indigenous people are using digital media and games specifically to share cultural experiences or not, just be Indigenous creators in this space. And that was really inspirational for me, specifically looking at games and saying, wow, like there are people like me who look like me, who come from communities like me and my family, presenting their full selves and their full stories. So that was super inspiring, and it really made me want to pursue this as an academic pursuit and understand what it means to make games from an Indigenous perspective. And so that led me to Montreal, where I am currently residing, and do my master's in media studies, but with a research creation focus. So through that pathway, I created this game as part of my research project called Terra Nova. And it explores, as Micaela mentioned in the intro, what first contact would look like between Indigenous and settler peoples if it was thousands and thousands of years into the future. And some really interesting things kind of emerged for me through that process, because once I kind of finished it, I realized that like it's almost like a representation of me as a person. My dad's Mohawk, and I have family from Six Nations who reside in Six Nations of the Grand River in southwestern Ontario here in Canada. And then also, my mom was born in Montreal, and her father's family is Finnish, and her mother's family is French Canadian. So it's very, like, I come from a very mixed background, and I have these, I kind of carry both of these perspectives with me wherever I go and with whatever I do. And so I saw that kind of totally reflected in the narrative of Terra Nova. It's a 2-player cooperative game. One player plays as Terra, this Indigenous coded character who lives on a future Earth, and then Nova, this kind of settler alien coded character who lives in the spaceship and is traveling through space with his community to try and like find a new home. So that's kind of how I was brought into this conversation, as the developer of this game. And yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I kind of lost along the way, but.
No, it's okay. And also sparked me another thing that while playing Terra Nova, one of the things I noticed is that the relationship created between these two characters that are the settler and the colonizer are cooperation relationships. And that's very different because always these kind of narratives are framed in a confrontational way. So one of the things that called to my attention of the game is like you are trying to create a new narrative about how the complexities of how colonial processes work. It's not just black and white. It's just not something that is very confrontational. It's just layers and layers of meaning about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I intentionally made Terra Nova's narrative to be super complicated. Like, I think in a lot of colonial nations lore, we have these moments where, the colonial society emerges just out of this moment of first contact. Like Chris Columbus lands in, the Caribbean, and he meets the people there, and he's like, all right, like this is America now. And then we know what comes after that. And it's not necessarily super good for Indigenous people, but it's really complex. But then you have moments where maybe it is good, and it's just complicated, and it's not black and white. But then we look into our media too, and even sci-fi, and we see this very much, alien versus human, locked in combat. It's always, either humans going out and colonizing another world and interacting with alien species, or, aliens coming here and War of the World style trying to take us over. So Terra Nova wanted to speak out against that. It wanted to show the moment instead of what came after, and really ask players to reflect on what are all the different possible scenarios that could come out of this moment. Does it have to be colonialism as we understand it, and settler domination, and Indigenous people is kind of like falling by the wayside? I mean, yes, that is kind of like our history, but also no, because there are, I believe, at least as we move into the future, we have these types of critical conversations about what it means to be, Indigenous and what it means to be settler, that we can come up with, new speculative future scenarios and build something more positive and equitable for everybody.
I can think that we are amongst nerds here, so I'm going to quote something for Star Trek. I don't know if you are into Star Trek, but one of the things on Deep Space Nine is like that. It's like showing the complexities that you have, like this tension between hate and love, and all kind of relationships that you establish with your colonizers. And speaking about dominance, that is a predominant theme, because we have, like, in video games, it's like this heroic culture and this hyper masculinity culture. And this is a question for both of you. How do you find yourself represented in games? When is the first time that you find yourself in a game, and did something click on you, or like saying, this is me, this is my community? What about you, Kishonna?
There's so much happening. There's so much that I even wanted to like say, like, you know, respond to, like with Maize. Is it possible for me to do that? Like, I'm gonna answer that question, but
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Okay.
Go whatever you want.
Maize, I often get like the question that people say that like gaming will catch up related to like diversity, equity, and inclusion and representations. Like we have to give them time, right? And I often so for instance, like I feel like that if you hadn't come along with your powerful narrative and your powerful game, the gaming industry would never have done that. You know, they tend to think, you know, that they just have to, you know, equip themselves with like the knowledge, and then they'll eventually like reach that point. And to me that sounds aspirational, but it also sounds foolhardy. It sounds like, you know, does it make sense what I'm saying? Like, so if we don't push them, do you think the industry will eventually reach the point where they're creating these beautiful, complex like narratives like you did, like in Terra Nova? What do you think about that?
Well, those are very nice words. I think that it's a really tough question, and definitely one that we're talking about a lot these days within the industry, but also in academic circles and within just like public discourse on Twitter and social media and all this. But I truly believe that, like, you know, these issues of representation in popular media need to be dealt with by the people that are and the communities that are being represented. And that means, and at every level, like not just from, you know, the consultancy on a project, you know, that has indigenous themes or Afro themes or, you know, Latinx themes, but all the way up through, you know, from that consultancy side to the developer side, production, and also like executive level, like people in tech, the tech community, in the gaming community are still from that like leadership, like rung of decision making. It's still pretty overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. And that's just the fact. So I think only through, you know, diversifying those spaces intentionally, because we have the capacity to be there, then that's when the change is going to come. And I think I was just doing my thing when I was creating Terra Nova. I was thinking critically about what I was doing, but I wasn't necessarily like wanting to put this in the hands of studios and saying like, do this, do better. But it was more, you know, that personal journey of reflection and growth. But I'm really glad it's being interpreted by people like yourselves, like that it could mean something more and be indicative of something more. And I mean, it wasn't really motivated by money. And I think that's something that needs to be called out too. Like games are like any other form of media. A lot of the decision making is motivated by profit. And I think that's really restrictive in our capitalist world, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I appreciate you taking time with that. I'm sorry. Now, Micaela, did you have a follow-up? But I'm going to answer your question now. I have an answer for that. I'm thinking about the first time that I, you know, saw myself as a Black woman, like reflected in a video game. I really don't think that really happened until 2011. Like that was just like what, 10 years ago, right? And when you think about how old the gaming industry is and how old games is. So Dead Island, zombie game, Perna Jackson, I believe she was the first time that I was able to play as a Black woman in a game. Now, I think around that same time, you know, Resident Evil had released, y'all remember when they went to Africa and had the African zombies, and Shiva was just like,
Shiva Lomar.
Yeah. I don't think we could play as her though. If I can recall, like I'm not a fan of the Resident Evil like series. You know, I never really played it. But I don't think can you play her, Micaela?
Interestingly, you can play it if you play the game in co-op. So if you have like the player 2, you can play as a woman. That says a lot about that. That if you wanted to play, yeah, very interesting.
Okay, well, even it was so many problems with that. I just refused to play that one because it was just so problematic. But I feel like Perna Jackson, Dead Island was the first time I was able to play as a Black woman. But they did the colorism thing in that game, right? So I remember like in the gameplay, Perna Jackson's a dark skinned Black woman, but in some of like the marketing and advertising materials, like they lightened her skin, and so so it's like a win and then a miss. It's like I guess we can't expect them to do everything perfect. But they were just like reinforcing European standards of beauty. Reinforcing especially like the problematic narrative of like colorism, especially in Black and brown communities, which we experience like a whole lot. So I think that was the first time, and I had fun. I think that's what got me into like the zombie genre because I was never really into like zombies, but Dead Island got me into it. So yeah, I answered your question finally. Sorry.
That's perfect. And what about you, Mace?
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit weirder, but when I first stepped into World of Warcraft and I was able to be a Tauren, which is this race of like cow human people, and their society, the art direction of that, playable race in this IP from Blizzard has them like wearing buckskin and feathers and live in teepees and stuff, and it's very like plains Native American aesthetic from like westerns and stuff, which is super problematic. It was never okay. It isn't okay. But there was something weird within me as like a young 11, 12-year-old gamer saying like, wow, like I feel like I can make a choice and I can make a choice to be an Indigenous character. And that felt really good. But yeah, it's not okay. It wasn't okay then. It's not okay now. It won't be okay moving forward. I really wish they would do something with that because it's such a big IP. I still play WoW to this day. It's kind of like what I'm really enjoying right now. But it's not great. So actually, on a more positive note, the first time that I played a game where I felt like I played as an Indigenous character in a way that was, as the developers treated with a lot of care, was Never Alone, Kasima and Ginchuna, which is this platformer cooperative. I feel like I've referenced it in Terra Nova a little bit, but you play as Nuna, who's this Inupiaq girl from Alaska, and you're moving through this world that's like really, really beautiful in the Arctic, and you're trying to like save your community from this never-ending blizzard that you don't know why it's there, but it's there. And you're doing so alongside your best friend, who's an Arctic fox, and it's just a really cute game. But it's also really culturally significant because it was done in consultation with the community. So I would recommend people go play that. It's like so much writing and media and commentary has been done on that game. But yeah, that was one that I was really, really excited about and kind of inspired me, springboarded me into doing the work that I was doing for the past several years. And on that note, I would love, Micaela, like what about you? You're kind of on the same playing field as us in terms of your relationship with games and
Oh yeah.
critical theory. So
the first time I really love the Gears of War series, and I love when I get to play with Anya, because I wanted to play as a cool warrior, as a cool woman. But for me, it was problematic because it was, as you were saying, the representation of a blonde girl that doesn't really had to do anything with me. So the last installation of the game, that when you have like another kind of character with a mixed heritage, kind of represent me more. But coming back, is Mass Effect is one of, as I was saying, one of my favorite games, and had this kind of very cool ability that you can shape your character in any way you want it. So I could create a character that was not only physically related to myself, but also with my values and my emotions. That is something very interesting because games are, for me, are ways and gateways for creating narratives of empathy, that you can try different skins and you can feel things that maybe an experiment with things that maybe you don't do in your real life, or you are not aware that you are in your real life. And so I value a lot these kind of rehearsal spaces that they allow us to try new things and to dream about to become things. I always say that I become interested in do research about the ethics of artificial intelligence while thinking about these alien races and these robot races and their struggles because they were machines, but they also were sentient and they were treated as slaves. So for me, games are a very powerful way to create these narratives and transmit a message. And this comes to something that I want to ask you if you have shared in your experiences and your research, is that games has been overlooked as something that is minor, that is something not worthy of study and research. And nowadays we have this kind of explosion of gaming, that everyone in lockdown is playing games, everyone is connecting through games. And even the World Health Organization has to change its view about addiction, because we have like these several layers on gaming that we can talk about, because we have like this individual level on how games affect us, how to create community through games. Also, the good and the bad about games, like the toxicity that they create. So we can create communities for good and we can find our peers through gaming, but also games enable a lot of toxicity and violence against women. And also, I wish we could have Celia to talk about this, the dark patterns of addiction that are trying to be embedded into games. What is your experience to kind of these layers of individual, collective, and also good and bad?
That's it's a lot in one question, right? So I want to break down, and I want to make sure that I think I understand like what you're asking. So I heard things about addiction, I heard things about, gaming being like ignored, but now all of a sudden everybody's like a gamer, right? I think that that's like really like interesting, the pandemic and COVID and like being in quarantine. I think it really highlighted, and of course reframed like a lot of our thinking around, our consumption, like our entertainment consumption, right? What we consider like leisure and what we consider like, recreation. But I feel like it also, I'm glad like it dismantled like a lot of that stigma, associated with like gaming, right? Because there's so much like even as academics, y'all know, like, we've got our colleagues asking us like, oh, you play video games? Oh, that's child's play. They have no idea about, the anatomy of gaming and the architecture of like the spaces. I'm like, it's more complex than that, right? And I think that that's why there's so little research, because it's not enough of us like who actually play, like doing like a lot of this work. So I love like, that we are, I love that moment. I love COVID probably only because of that, because it really told the world that anybody can be a gamer and you should be gaming right now because you have nothing else to do. Like, I love that narrative, right? But I also want to make sure that, I saw, of course, like the other problematic narratives that were associated with that, right? Of course, we saw a lot of that moral panicky like language. Of course, the addiction conversations were happening, and of course, conversations around like screen time. And, parents are like, well, we're cooped up all day. Well, what's all this screen time going to do to my child? What's all this doing? And luckily, we've got like decades of research that, can dismantle, like disband all that. But I don't know if that information was getting to the people who really needed it. I think that's one of the concerns that I had, when I saw like some of the popular articles like coming out, from like the Washington Post or whatever, or, like New York Times, like, I don't know that we're in control of our narratives enough, like within the gaming world, right? And I don't know, like, what I'm gonna say, like, games journalism, they spend a lot of time like inward focusing and like internal, like looking, and not really realizing that there's like this outward external conversation that we need to be in charge of, and like we need to be controlling as well, because right now it's still like, the folks who are, of the moral panic variety, who are really like controlling like a lot of the narratives right now. And I think that's kind of like what you were getting at, like with like the addiction kind of conversation, right? But I think that, whenever I had my gaming lab, I spent a lot of time like with guardians and parents and elders, of children, to help them like understand, okay, this is what your child is doing in this game. This is what they're doing when they're spending all of this amount of time there, and getting them to like reframe reframe that and to see, you know, I also hate to like reduce what we're doing like in games to like skills-based conversations. I'm like, but they're developing this skill, they're learning how to do that. They can possibly translate this into maybe something like a career, or, you know, translate it into like, you know, a skill that they could take into like a computer science major or something, you know. But we have to like finesse it like in those ways so people can understand and not just think that their kids are like, you know, wasting their time when they're on Roblox all day, you know. And so I guess I wish we had like a lot more of that, you know, the people who are like the advocates and cheerleaders of like games that are having these public conversations, you know, because I hate that, you know, it's like you know, I don't want to, you know, publicly like shame like people, but, you know, if we think about, you know, like high profile people like Ninja that like dominate like the conversation, and then people get like a negative view and like it's like skewed negatively, you know, like, well, why would I want my girls in a space where, you know, people don't want to play with them because they're girls, or why would they be in there because all this toxic spaces, and I can't send, you know, let my kids watch YouTube because of all the toxic algorithm that's going to feed them all this awful stuff, you know. I'm like, yes, I get all that, but, you know, there's other things like happening. And I feel like that we spend so much of our time combating those kinds of narratives that I don't want to say it stops our building and it stops our growth, but I'm sitting here thinking about when I'm asked to give a talk and how much I have to like talk about racism and sexism. I'm like, okay, but there's so much more here than just that. But, you know, I know a lot of people are still just like at that conversation, and I get it. But I just wish we were further along. You know, when you think about like imagining like the future, I guess I just wish that we were having different kinds of conversations. But we're still kind of having like the same conversations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Every time I gave a lecture or a talk, one of the things I start to dismantle this prejudice is like showing the other side of gaming. Because I don't know your views on this, but for me, it's like people tend to see video games as thinking like movies is all Marvel Studios and superhero movies. So they don't know that like this kind of independent side of gaming and all these beautiful narratives and beautiful games. So my first take on this is like showing 2, 3, 4 games like My Name is Sam, like This War of Mine, like games about being a migrant. I showed parents about this game, That Dragon Cancer. The whole people have translated their suffering experience into a game, because another prejudice against gaming is like games are created for fun. And one of the things that for me that we should kind of talk about is that games are ways to tell stories. And the story that you're going to tell is up to you. So a game can contain a sad story, a beautiful narrative, something talking about the war from the perspective of a survivor, or talking about the war from the perspective of someone that is losing a loved one to the war. But I think that one of the things that we have to aspire for as people working in the space of video games is that to deconstruct this narrative of games are for teenagers, just for fun, and just about menial things that are irrelevant and won't be useful, and that you're wasting your time while you're playing games.
Yeah, if I could just chime in here too, you know, I just want to thank you both for like all the work that you're doing with your communities and beyond, like sharing that word. I have definitely bumped up against that in my experience as well. If I could just digress a little bit and talk about like what happened when I was wrapping up development on Terra Nova and I was like doing play testing. I was at my mom's house and I was like, hey, like we're gonna do a presentation like with your students because she's an elementary school teacher. You know, we're gonna do a presentation on this game with your students tomorrow. Like, don't you want to test out the game and see how it is? And at this point, like she knew I was working on a game, but she didn't really know much about it. And she's never really engaged with video games at all, other than through me and, you know, forming her thoughts and opinions about how I've interacted with them, you know, from her perspective as a mother. And then also, you know, hearing, as you guys said, like through the, you know, just external commentary through, you know, other sources of media that aren't necessarily like part of the gaming industry. And, you know, we played the games together, you know, we played this cooperative experience together, and she said like, wow, like, thank you for sharing this. I didn't know that games could be about anything other than killing other people with guns. And I was like, yeah, like I had no interest in creating a game where, you know, we were violent toward one another, or, you know, we saw blood and gore just for entertainment purposes. Like, this is a game about a story that I wanted to tell, and a story that I wanted to share with others, because it's a story that I've been thinking about for a long time. And I think it has something to contribute. So, I mean, maybe it's a little bit my fault of playing games like Call of Duty when I was growing up, and showing the stuff to her and introducing this stuff to her back then. But I really love how our relationship kind of grew, and our understanding of one another grew a little bit more through having that experience with this game that I was just creating because I was interested in creating it.
And for me, also games, as you were saying, that it enabled this conversation with your mom. I'm seeing a lot of parents that are starting to play games with their teenagers, and they find in this kind of not looking into the eyes of one another, but playing by side, like this space where they can have like very difficult conversations, and in this kind of relaxed game. So I also value this kind of games, because sometimes people take value from Fortnite of this kind of social games, just thinking that I'm a day-by-daylight player, and I play almost weekly with my friends, and that's my space to talk about our week, to unwind, but also to construct our relationship. And I think that this is something that sometimes get lost in the narratives of video games, that people get isolated in games, that people play alone. And the reality is that we play together, and that we construct things together, and that we can extract conversations from those games.
I think that's a beautiful point, Micaela. And I think that that's where a lot of folks don't even realize, the possibilities and potentials of what gaming can offer, right? Just that community building. And it's so interesting. I'm just thinking about how equipped gamers were for quarantine, right? Like, they were already ready to go. I'm like, hey, I'm like, and even think about, I remember, hearing some of my, like some of the parents that are part of like school groups, and just hearing them talk about that their kids were missing out on so much social, and I couldn't contribute to that conversation. Was like, my children are not missing out on social, because they have a social life like through games. And I think that was like, it was like one of those communities of like, parents who are really restrictive over like screen time, of course, devaluing and diminishing like games, and I was sitting in an iPad and stuff, and they were not prepared for quarantine. They were not prepared, and their kids weren't equipped, to have, to continue with like social relationships and with community, because they didn't allow their kids to like play games and like be in there. And so I'm just thinking about how much like, gamers didn't struggle. I mean, there were other struggles. Like, I'm not, trying to diminish it like in that way, but I think that that's like a great point that you made there, Micaela. But I think that there's so much that folks can learn from the gaming space as well and take forward. Like, I'm even thinking about how much like the gamers like helped like our gaming students help like the professors with like online classes of like, hey, you don't have to just use Zoom, and you don't have to just use this, you can use Twitch. I'm just thinking about, I remember doing like a workshop like to help like, a lot of my colleagues think about like different modalities and different ways to like deliver information. I'm like, you don't have to just be stuck in Blackboard. There are like some cool things. I'm just thinking about just how gamers were ready for quarantine. We were really primed, for that moment. And, we shined a whole lot too.
Totally. I totally agree with that, because we had the lights, we had the streaming capabilities, and also it's amazing. Yeah, that's right. I remember a few years ago that I couldn't travel to a conference, and I proposed to them, like, I do regular streamings. I teach on Twitch how to play Magic the Gathering. That is another game that I'm passionate about. And I proposed to them, like, hey, we can do this. I can't travel, but we can do this over Twitch, and we can do this over YouTube. And that was a gaming conference. And that was kind of, we can do this. So for me, it's like super interesting to see how, and this kind of takes me to another area of research that are streamers, because now gamers were kind of consuming entertainment products, but now they have integrated themselves into this kind of creation process. And now they have become creators themselves, and they are taking games and transforming games, which for me, as a digital and cultural artifact, is amazing. Because I did a lot, my background is in intellectual property law, and I did a lot with these kind of restrictions that you have over how you do playing games. And one of the amazing things about streaming is like, if you want to stream a movie, you are going to get, that movie is going to get down, that stream is going to take down immediately. But it didn't happen with games. And this kind of symbiosis between the publishers and the developers and the gamers that enable this space to create over this kind of their intellectual property without asking gamers to pay a license. And now gamers are like, we are entitled to do this with these games. And that created this kind of beautiful space when streamers and people playing sports for money and esports has flourished. And this is amazing because it separates video games from other creative industries. And we have these kind of kids that are creating careers and they are doing kind of these creative outlets through streaming. And for me, this is something that my generation didn't have it. And for me, it's amazing.
I wonder, I didn't know if Maize was gonna like respond to that, but there was something, are we okay for time? Because there was something I wanted to like revisit and like ask Maize and ask you all's opinion. Okay, great. One of the things that I wonder, Maize, as you were talking, about you being in that space and like creating your game and also like playing, the problematic narratives of, Black, Indigenous, Latinx folks, Asian populations, just how problematic those narratives like have been in games. I remember having like a conversation and thinking about like a different media. We were talking about like film and TV. And there's something that we called like the Tyler Perry effect of how, there are problematic narratives that are out there, but because that's all we have, like we need to consume it, and we have to consume it to prove to the industry that we have consumption power, that we will support that, and that in turn would lead to more diverse narratives. I never agreed with that because I'm like, if we accept like the stereotypical kinds of like practices, then they're going to always give us that because that's what's going to, sell. That's what's going to make money. And when you go more complex, the audiences aren't ready to consume that. Does that make sense? Like what I'm saying? Do you all, what are your thoughts like on that of like, okay, just because we have that content that we have to consume it? Yes, because we do it. I really thought about your play with World of Warcraft, Maize, made me think about that.
Yeah, this is kind of the question, right? Is like, how do we push the narrative forward externally when we can also push the narrative forward internally within the spaces too? I don't know if I have an answer for it, so maybe I'll just talk about how this has touched me in my research and stuff, which is like through my research and creating Terra Nova as part of my thesis in my master's, I also was looking at Indigenous video game development practices in general and kind of like that history. And what I was finding, or what I found in like the work of, for example, Elizabeth LaPonce, who's a Métis, Anishinaabe, and Irish game developer and scholar, and as well as like the work of Aboriginal territories in cyberspace, which is a research lab at Concordia that I got to work with while I was doing my master's, is like Indigenous communities and Indigenous people will consume games and media and representations of themselves, but it amazing change really happens when the tools of production are really placed into the hands of those creators, and they get to be in power and make decisions about what enters into the things that they create. So I don't think we're ever going to really get to a point where we're seeing good cultural and diverse representations in games and other media until, again, like what I was saying before, I was like, when we're in the boardrooms, in the writing rooms, in the developers' chairs, even coding, creating the game and the design from the code up, And, you know, diverse experiences are even like factored into those decisions too. And again, like power is such a big part of that.
For me, also, I agree that diversity is key to have each and every one of us representing all along the process of creation of video games. And if I can chime in with something about the industry, because my background, I did a bit of video game journalism, and I covered conferences as E3. And one of the things I realized is like when a big company like Microsoft is acquired some other studios, they are acquired indie studios because of their originality. So for me, independent studios are the ones that's going to save the industry. The industry needs these kind of refreshing and new stories. And they're going like to mix up because one, they have the resources to provide to the developers. And also the developers have like this creativity that sometimes they don't have like the economic possibilities to create. So this is a mix up where beautiful things can happen. And also I think that we are going to move into a space when everyone can be a creator, because you have tools like Dreams and you have like tools that you can create a game without needing to be like a coder, because another prejudice about creating a game and being a developer is that you need to code. And there are a lot of roles that you can assume when producing a game. So I think that part of the job is like to make people realize that they can work in the game industry and they can enter the game industry and not necessarily be like a coder or an artist. Maybe you write beautiful stories, so you can contribute from there. And also from the video game industry standpoint is that you realize this, they are going to realize that they need this refreshing quality of originality from creators and the diverse backgrounds, with the diverse backgrounds.
Yeah, I think that makes plenty of sense. Thank you all like for engaging like with that conversation. And I know one of the things that I always try to tell folks, I'm like, okay, the stereotypical narrative is like, okay, sure. Like, it's not that it's not true. It's that we don't have like enough alternative narratives so that audiences who don't know enough about our populations, won't just believe that that's who we are all the time, right? So I'm thinking about like, thinking about like GTA and showing like, like struggle classes of like, Black and Latinx like folks or whatever. And I'm like, sure, yeah, we know drug dealers. I got drug dealers like in my family, but we're more than that, like, we have, there are professors in my family. There are like, people who, working class folks like in my family, So I guess I wish that we could get away from like that limited narrative, right? Because our populations and our communities are so much more than the stereotypes. Yeah.
We are like almost 13 minutes. We have 13 minutes, but I didn't want to go without asking you about the future of video games. Because one of the things that I'm super interested in doing research about is the metaverse and this kind of new step, this evolving step from internet that mixes social media platforms and gaming and create this kind of virtual worlds united, but also like all in the same place. That's this kind of all-encompassing space. And there are thought as really immersive space and places where people can have all the different aspects of their life, but recreated in a digital setup with all the problematic things about living a digital life that is privatized because you're going to play it and be in a private space. And what do you think about the future of video games and futurism in video games? Is like, do you see a connection between these two topics?
Maize, do you want to go? Because I can jump on in there if you want. Okay. I think about this a lot because I think about Afrofuturism a lot, right? But I think the industry as it's currently constructed is not prepared or equipped with the tools to be able to create diverse futures that really make sense for our populations, right? Because right now, sure, DEI, okay, diversity, equity, and inclusion, okay, I feel like that's like the that's like the easy way out, right? So we see now a lot of the industry, they don't mind like making statements like stop Asian hate or Black Lives Matter, right? It's like part of their brands now, right? It's cool now, so they don't mind doing it, right? So I'm just thinking about, all those companies, all those gaming companies that put out like, Black Lives Matter statements or put out, language in support of, like the violence against like Asian populations. They haven't done much else, right? But that's part of like the DEI approach. That's a part of like, well, we'll just create, put these statements, we'll hire a few folks, we'll do this, but there's not real change, right? Some people say that that's incremental change. I disagree. I don't think that that's change at all. I think that they're just like placating, right? And they're just, trying to like do things, they're just putting band-aids on like wounds, right? Because, they're a part of like these legacies and the vestiges of like, racialized institutions. And, they're part of like, the structure, supporting and upholding like white supremacy. And if like, they can't like address those kinds of things, then, the future's still going to be problematic. Like, I really didn't think, well, I'm just going to say the statement, but I don't really, but I'm just thinking about the conversations that we're having now are conversations that we had 10 years ago, and what I heard from other folks that they had 10 years prior to that. Like, so the conversations aren't evolving and aren't changing. We're still thinking about, how to get like women and girls into like STEM because of the leaky pipe in STEM. Why can't we keep them, right? Why won't they stay? But we're not thinking, we're also individualizing, a lot of these problems and saying, well, if we can, and it's also blaming the victim. Like, think about like how much pressure is like on the oppressed, is like on us to have to do something about our oppression. Why do we have to be the ones educating folks? Why do we have to be the ones that to say, okay, well, you're messing up, don't do that, that's a misstep, don't, like, these folks are not, they're not dumb. These folks are like some among like the most brilliant minds like in the world, but they can't figure out how to fix these problems. Like, to me, that's willful, right? That they want to be there. They have a continued investment, or, just like, Professor Lipsitz might say this, they have this possessive investment in white masculinity and upholding and supporting those. So if we think about like the future, we haven't dismantled like the foundation that grew this, right? The roots are bad. We think about like a tree, we're trying to say, okay, well, the pretty leaves are going to come soon, but the pretty tree, the pretty leaves are going to be from damaged roots. And to me, we have to uproot the whole tree, and we have to start over. And we have to start over like in a way that that incorporates us from jump, that values us from jump. Now you see like different like different companies trying to like do this kind of stuff, but I think that if we don't have like a massive overhaul, we're just going to continue to see a lot of the same. I'm sorry, I wish that was like more hopeful. I'm sorry that's like, but I just have to be real about what I see the future is like in this moment too.
Absolutely. We are still paying the consequences of Gamergate, and we're still seeing this kind of culture that is embedded into the gaming culture. And for me, from Women in Games Argentina and the topics and the things we participate in, it's like we are trying to like educate on Twitter and trying to tell other people like, okay, having this female character that is on a chainmail bikini is not inclusion. It's not like you have a woman character. That is not representation. Having a woman character is not representation. So we are still fighting these battles. We're still hearing the same arguments that are coming from the Gamergate. And for me, it's also problematic that this kind of narrative had expanded to politics. And we see some arguments that were held on Gamergate that were sustained with people, followers in like the US presidential election campaign of Trump. And we see these kind of narratives replicated in the Twitch channels and the followers of these narratives. So for me, this is bad, but I try to keep like this future of hope, and that we can create spaces for new games and new narratives, and like continue to make noise about this, and can kind of continue to make people aware about the potential of games and of gaming. And I don't know if you, Maize, you want to chime in to this, or if not, it's totally fine.
I definitely want to chime in now, just after how you both we're taking up the topic. I just like couldn't gather my thoughts because they all went in a billion different directions about, you know, virtual worlds, the metaverse moving forward, all of these like really big questions that a lot of companies and individuals are going to be tackling over the next few years and beyond. But I think I just want to echo what Kishonna said kind of at the end there, was like the roots are bad, you know, and this goes down to the very, you know, bottom of this whole process of what it means to operate within virtual spaces, like the ones and zeros, the binary, you know, black and white, yes, no, affirmative, you know, unaffirmative. It's just too limiting. It's too prescriptive. I think we need a new dimension or two or three for which we approach these concepts. So that's what I'll say. I mean, I'm really interested to see how not only indigenous communities and cultures, you know, as diverse as we are, think about the universe and think about reality and think about virtual space in relation to reality. Because I think a lot of really fruitful discussions and alternatives to kind of how our mindset is kind of framed in this, you know, westernized hegemonic system, but then also, you know, the voices of other diverse perspectives as well are super important, not just culturally, but, you know, thinking along gender lines and thinking along like economic lines too. Like, I think that's something that we haven't really talked about much either in this conversation, is like the stratification that we're seeing around the world, you know, of the ultra rich and the ultra poor, is just getting further and further with less and less space in between. And I think games are pretty inaccessible still, and something that I'm really passionate about making more, you know, accessible in the future. So I'll kind of just leave it at that. Like when I think about them, I have trouble thinking about the metaverse because I just hear metaverse, I think inaccessible.
There are so many topics that I want to talk to you. We should need like 5 more hours because, as you were saying, we didn't enter into like the economics of this and the accessibility to the consoles and the accessibility to PCs. I have heard in an interview, Kishonna, that you were talking about how you started studying console gaming because you didn't have access to a PC when you were growing up. And that's very limiting. I did on my side, I didn't have access to a console until I was like in my late 20s. And for me, this is also, we didn't rise to the point of sustainability and the impact that is having on the planet, this massive consumption of electricity going around in creating this and sustaining these gaming environments. We are almost at 3 minutes time to end this talk, which I wish didn't end because it's fascinating to talk to both of you. And I would love to end with like a quick question. It's like, Maize, I know that you have already created a game, but what will be your next project? And Kishonna, if you are going to create a game, what game would be and how that it would look like?
I'll go first. There's nothing in the works right now, unfortunately. I actually recently started a position at Unity Technologies, which is the big, you know, game engine, a couple months back, and I've been really like pouring all my heart and soul into joining the industry and seeing how like the other world works outside of academia. That was kind of a goal of mine when I wrapped up my master's. Was to just like see what the industry was like and get that firsthand experience, and it's been great with Unity so far. So nothing super creative in the works at the moment, unfortunately, but I am super, you know, passionate about having these conversations with folks like you. Just chatting, talking, connecting, building, you know, a network of people having these types of conversations. And also just like I see my role now that I've kind of been there and done that and created a game, supporting other up and comers as well. I think I'm super passionate about, like, there's a whole indigenous video game developer community that is just you know, growing right now, and it's really cool to see all the work that's coming out of those folks. And yeah, I want nothing more than to support them and make sure that they're creating awesome stuff and they have the tools and the ability to do that. So that's kind of it for me at this point. But I would love to make more stuff in the near future.
That was beautiful, Maize. I think I'm not about creating content and producing things just for the sake of doing it, just because I can, right? And so I do it because I might see some voids or see some gaps or see some areas for improvement or areas for development. But I think, gaming is in good hands if, like, if we follow the recommendations that, Micaela made of, like, really focusing on, like, the indie scene, the independent scene of seeing all the amazing stuff. So now I can see myself. I can see narratives from like diverse perspectives. So, I think that was, if you would have asked me this maybe like 15 years ago, it would have been like a different answer. I would have been like, I want to make a game that does A, B, C, and D, right? But I've seen that. Terra Nova, so many other like examples, so I'm not compelled to do that, but I'm gonna just echo what Maize just said. I would love to just continue to connect folks to like the important to industry, to access, to like to get resources, to get opportunities. So I think that's what I see myself like doing right now. Yeah.
This has been an amazing conversation, and I'm so grateful the possibility to chat with the two of you. So Maize and Kishonna, thank you so much for joining us today for this Fireside chat, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in future conference and future forums, and to get more and more academics into the video game spaces. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting.